Well, good morning. Well, almost lunchtime. It's getting close. For the next 30 minutes, I'd like to invite you to join me in reimagining the agency business model. There's a pretty good reason why we need to do this. Industry consultant Michael Farmer, who some of you might know, has really extensively studied this question and reports that advertising agency income per unit of work is his definition, has actually fallen more than 40% over a steady 20-year decline. That's pretty shocking. Now, some of you, I've heard from many agencies say, well, we actually have had a pretty good year last year. 2013 was a record year. 2012 was a pretty solid year. But you're talking mostly about revenues. When I ask you how those years looked in terms of profitability, I usually get a very different answer. And guys, it's the margin that matters. And other consultancies like Morgan Anderson have just released new studies showing that while if you look at, say, holding company revenues, that you see that they've been going up, look at the profitability figures, and they are headed in the opposite direction at double the rate. Now, it is true that there is just as much money being spent in marketing as there ever was. It's just that less and less of that money is being spent through us, through advertising agencies, or at least through what could be considered typical or conventional ad agencies, which none of us like to think of ourselves that way, of course. But I think at the heart of our problem, the reason that the advertising agency business model feels stalled, is because we've lost sight of what it is we really sell. And this will look familiar to you from your days in school, where most of us learned about the 4 Ps of marketing. And if you look at these 4 Ps, there's one that stands out in terms of what we do and where we focus most of our time and attention, isn't there? It's that P labeled promotion. And we've really allowed ourselves to be seen as the promotion guys or the advertising guys, the communications guys, forgetting that the other 3 elements of the marketing mix are actually and arguably maybe more important, these elements of product, place, and price. And if you look at some innovative business models like IDEO, I think that's a firm a lot of us admire. They actively work in these other areas of the marketing mix. They're involved in a lot of product innovation and design, helping to simplify the design of the bicycle, to, in the area of place, helping optimize the experience of going to an emergency room. Now, that's pretty interesting. Is that marketing? Sure it is. It's an important aspect of marketing that we could be much, much more involved in. Now, I love this model that I'm about to share with you. This is the work of Clayton Christensen, the father of disruption theory. And he has a spectrum in which he says, you know, there is an area that you could consider overdeveloped. And in the professional service business, this would be overdeveloped services, meaning these are services that largely are given to clients that are largely satisfied. These are overserved markets. There are a lot of providers of these overdeveloped services, and therefore very intense price pressure, low margins. And if we define our business model, and I'm sure none of you ever use this language, right? If we define our business model as a full-service integrated agency offering a wide variety of services, serving a wide variety of markets, that clearly plays to this left side of the spectrum, doesn't it? And this is why we have such intense pricing pressure. This is why we're lined up and shopped on spreadsheets by clients. So you're going to expect what this other side of the spectrum is going to look like. These are the underdeveloped services. These are unsatisfied client needs. These are underserved markets. And there are few people doing this. There are few agencies and few firms doing this, and therefore these carry much higher margins. This is the law of supply and demand, right? What is scarce is valuable. And so this is the interesting new territory where we need to be headed. And we see things like this from, this is Wyden and Kennedy's new venture, John Jay, their executive creative director, who is announcing Garage. Will be a strategic and entrepreneurial shop that will concept, create, and invest in innovative products, experiences, content, and technology that will help to redefine the idea of what a modern global brand is. That's pretty interesting. That's pretty different from a full-service agency offering a wide variety of services. Let's look at some pretty disruptive agency business models. I'm going to show you a lot of examples today. Some of them are going to go by fairly quickly, but I'm better to show you a lot of examples, I think. So this is the world's fastest agency. Have you seen this? Step one, the client deposits $999 via PayPal. Step two, you tweet a 140-character brief. Step three, the agency tweets back to you their creative solution. That's it, world's fastest agency. Have you seen the concept of pop-up agencies? I think these were unveiled at South by Southwest a year or two ago, and now there are business models built around this. So the pop-up agency, this is one of the European ventures. We fly to your location, we work for 48 hours, we deliver a concept or strategy, then we move on to the next location. Now, there's a lot not to like about these models. I realize you're looking at this saying, yeah, that's interesting, but maybe not so practical. But you've got to give these organizations credit for disrupting the business model, right? We stand up at conferences like this saying we need to disrupt our model. Well, here's some pretty good examples. But I'd like to explore the dynamics and dimensions of agency business models through some different lenses and invite us to see ourselves as not ad agencies or professional service firms, but could we see ourselves as product developers? And there are some pretty interesting examples of that. John Windsor, who started Victors and Spoils, says instead of being executors of communication campaigns, we must become inventors, architects, and conductors. The brands we all love see themselves that way. Nike and Apple, for example, don't really make anything. They invent products, but leave it to their vendors to build them. It's much better to be an Apple than a Foxconn. Interesting point of view. And so to be in the product development business, we see firms like Anomaly, who many of you are familiar with. They've presented at this conference a number of times, who are deeply into this concept. They helped incubate, develop this whole EOS line of cosmetics, which has now become quite successful, distributed through Target and other places. They also own a big equity stake. KBS, which may be here with us today, I read about this just recently. Custom nail polish. Pretty interesting, but this is an agency stepping in and saying, well, we feel like we can learn by investing more in product development and having our clients feel like we're in there, living their life and involved in more of the P's of marketing. In Amsterdam, this is the agency John Doe, who developed what they call the world's simplest phone. This is the world's simplest mobile phone. And again, their motivation is to be able to sit down with the client and say, well, we understand the problems you're having with pricing and distribution because we're experiencing them with our very own product. And then, of course, agency business models that are expressly built around product development. This is Pilot. We create artful, handcrafted products that live at the intersection of marketing and engineering. Rockfish, who many of you know, they were named Small Agency of the Year a few years ago. And they are in the business of interactive prototyping, what they call product evolution. A really interesting territory for agencies to be in. Let's look at this idea of agencies as incubators. Now, certainly we know how to incubate ideas and concepts and programs and campaigns. Could we also be in the business of helping incubate ideas about products, new products? And there's a lot of interesting thinking around this. Here's Bob Greenberg from RGA. Agencies will transform into broad-ranging companies that provide business transformation consulting, product innovation, technology innovation, brand development, and a myriad of production capabilities. The agency part of these new companies will just be a piece of the whole, not the entire business. In other words, the agent part of what we do will become less and less important. So the agent part meaning our role as a middleman in which we act as an agent on behalf of a third party, media and so forth, become a lot less important to us. And we've got to fill that with something else. And there are some interesting models. I know a lot of you probably are aware of what Wieden & Kennedy's done here with PI. This is the Portland Incubator Experiment. And this is the agency being actively engaged in helping incubate new startups and new product and service ideas. This is Deutsch LA. I don't know if they're here with us today, but really interesting model with their inventionist business. And they actually plot out a cycle showing we can work for you for 5 days in 5-day sprints for ideas, in 45-day cycles for prototypes, or 6-month deep dives for true product development. And they even attach some pricing to it right on their website. So that's being pretty upfront about being in the incubation product development business. And then Huge. Their version of incubation, and I know other agencies who do this, is that they actually incubate ideas from their own people, from their own employees. And they solicit these ideas, and they'll spend money behind them and develop them, help bring them to market. Because agencies are full of pretty smart people, obviously. Speaking of labs, some of you have a lab. And this is a great way to innovate your business model without having to completely disrupt what you're doing at the mothership to start a lab. And the motivations for starting a lab are pretty interesting because the agencies that I know that have done it say, what this does is it helps keep us at the forefront of technology. It helps us to explore new territory without having to worry too much, at least for a while, about whether it's contributing to our bottom line. We're willing to do a little investment spending for a year or two. But most of the successful labs are now profit centers in their own right. And I've talked to a lot of agencies who say, yeah, that actually is now making some pretty good revenue for us. Will Nichols of the British agency DARE, and these are one of the early innovators, they have a very active lab. He said, traditionally, agencies have created value for their clients through better and different communications. But brand behavior can now come to life in digital products, services, and experiences. So this challenges the idea, are we really in the message business? I think increasingly we will not be in the message business, or at least not exclusively in the message business. And labs are one of the ways we can explore new territories. So here's the Razorfish Emerging Experiences Lab that develops everything from digital wallets to new ways, new projection technologies. The spirit of the lab, of course, is test and learn, isn't it? Test and learn. And this is us being willing to place a series of small bets on ourselves, knowing that some of these will not pay off, some will. But in any case, we learn through the experience, we become better as an agency, we become more innovative. And it's no coincidence that the agencies that I think are making waves creatively and have the best reputations and are making the A-list, a lot of these firms do tend to have a lab attached to their organizations. Here's BBH Labs. They're one of the early entries into the labs concept. Very, very smart group of people here. One of my favorite blogs to read is the BBH Labs blog and their Twitter feed. Always really good, interesting, innovative thinking coming out of the lab. We have the folks from Berkeley here, I know, and this is their lab concept, Moonshot, which is designed to do the same thing, help them explore new territory. In Canada, this is a digital agency called Tehan and Lax they're very, very progressive in this area. They write 1,000-word blog posts all about their experiences in their lab, and they're very transparent about what works, what's failed, what they learned, and they know their clients are reading this. And sometimes I read these posts and I think, wow, that is you're being pretty forthcoming here about how you failed at something. But they view it as a strategic advantage, a competitive advantage, because they're such a talent magnet. These guys are so talented at what they do, they attract a lot of very, very smart people. They helped incubate and co-develop readability, which many of you have on your mobile devices. This helps clean up web pages and just serves it up as kind of a straight text. And so that's an example of some investment in a lab that actually is paying off. And labs don't have to be about putting together physical objects. They don't have to be about technology and circuit boards. Labs can be about intellectual property, like the new Sanders Wingo Behavioral Science Lab, which was just announced. And this is all about applying the new school of behavioral economics to solving client problems. But it's done in a lab context where they partner with research professionals. And so it's not a physical, their output isn't a physical product necessarily, it is intellectual capital that this agency is going to be able to innovate and help build their reputation. So we're here in LA. It's appropriate that we talk about this idea of agencies as studios. And this is based on the idea that we heard the Star Group talk this morning about, that increasingly we're dependent on to be factories for content, and that content marketing is a much different business model from the kind of episodic sequential ad development process that we've all kind of grown up with. Being in the content development business, it requires a different skill set and a different structure. So we see some agencies that are now describing themselves this way. This is Deep Local. We're an innovation studio that creates remarkable experiences for brands using the word studio. Look at this lineup of services: hardware, design, mobile, software, and PR. How's that for a lineup of interesting services in a studio model? Omelette here in LA. The studio is a big part of their business model, and by studio I don't mean production studio, not like the old studios you might be thinking of 20 or 30 years ago. This is studio in the Hollywood sense. This is, as they say, multi-platform, branded and original content. This is Instrument in Portland. We combine design thinking and technical craft. Again, the studio concept. So that's an interesting point. This can be a unit of the main agency. It could be a separate company, but the idea of a high volume producer of content for clients in a studio context, I think, is an interesting way to think about it. This next area I think is really fascinating, and we're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming years. And this is the idea that agencies, that we can be in the business not of just creating brand awareness, creating intent to purchase, and all of those perceptual things that we tend to do well, but that we could actually be involved in helping create the actual experience with the brand. If you think about the fact that 70% of the GDP in developed nations comes from service businesses, there's a lot of potential here. This is from a book by a group of professionals on service design, they say most products are actually services. Insurance is actually a service. They think of themselves as a product, but it's a service. This provides great opportunities for marketing firms to get into the business of optimizing the customer experience. So again, we think of ourselves as being pretty much at the top of the funnel. We help create demand. We help create preference. We don't see ourselves as being at the bottom of the funnel very often, unless you're maybe in the customer service business as your core business. But this suggests that there are lots of opportunities for us to get deeper in the funnel as part of our business model. Let me show you what I mean. This area of experience design, sometimes called service design, really, for some reason, started in the Scandinavian countries, from what I can tell. It's big in Stockholm and Oslo. It migrated into Germany and the UK, and finally, making its way onto the shores of North America. This is Veride, which now has a New York office. They're Swedish-based, and they are all about helping brands improve the experience that customers have with the brand. And they help design the experience. They help design a service. So the process of getting a loan. Now, conventional ad agency would say, we're going to create traffic to the bank, we're going to create leads so that you can then sell them a loan. The experience design model would say, well, that's important, but what happens when they actually start to go through the process? And they would map a service blueprint. They would design the experience of getting a loan, which is pretty high value, isn't it? That certainly falls into the category of underdeveloped services, things that are of high value and high demand by clients. So as I say, there are now a few small experiments with this going on in the US. This is Cake in Minneapolis. And maybe a firm that some of you have heard of already that's very good at this in the Bay Area, Adaptive Path. Great businesses are built on great experiences. We make those experiences happen. So that's a pretty different business model from the conventional agency. The other thing that's happening is that progressive agencies are starting to define themselves beyond their four walls. They're not necessarily defining their agencies as people at desks. That's kind of an industrial age definition of what work is, isn't it, and what a business is. The new way of thinking is, well, actually, there is a very large global talent pool, especially in professional services. And this applies just as much, by the way, to law firms and accounting firms and architectural firms. Those of us who sell intellectual capital, they're starting to realize that to say that we're these people in this office at this location is not a very 21st century definition of what a professional knowledge firm really is about. This book, Leadership, which I find pretty mind-bending, very strongly makes the point that the expertise that drives organizational value now actually resides in a network of relationships outside the organization itself. In other words, there's just as much or more value outside the organization as within. In professional services, we ought to be a lot more aggressive and a lot more inventive in marshaling that intellectual capital for our benefit. And there are a lot of different experiments with this. One of the early models that most of you have heard of is Victors and Spoils in Boulder, who famously call themselves the world's first crowdsourced agency. And if you look at their business model, you would see they have a CEO and a CFO and a director of client service and a director of account planning and account people and even a creative director. What they don't have is a traditional creative department because their creative work is, they draw upon this global talent pool in various forms, crowdsourcing, expert sourcing. They look outside themselves for creative solutions that pretty interesting and compelling business model for a lot of marketers. They've been purchased by Havas, so now they've exported this kind of thinking out to the entire Havas network, where, and this is a form of the Star Group's the tank, I think, where they say, well, look, we've got a lot of intellectual capital right within the Havas network, so let's at least marshal that so that we can draw upon that for solving client problems. Richard Kirschenbaum formed NSG SWAT, which he calls a hybrid advertising agency, and this is, again, using a network of mostly outside professionals to do this work. There are a lot of interesting models. There's in New York, there's the agency Co, founded by Ty Montague and Rosemary Ryan, formerly of JWT, that are built on this model. And as I say, this transcends the advertising business. There's a lot of innovation going on in this area in law and accounting, architecture, other professional services. Bernstein Rain, Kansas City, they're here today, have a separate unit they call Boom, and this is all about harnessing that global talent pool. They use crowdsourcing and the idea of bounties and so forth to help generate ideas for a lot of their retail business, especially. It's especially appropriate for that kind of business. Now, we've been touching on this, I think, throughout these other sections, but ultimately, we are in the intellectual property business. We don't think of ourselves that way, but we could. And there is a pretty strong point of view among some agencies that we really ought to think of ourselves not as in the service business, but as in the IP business. That we are not or should no longer be doing work for hire. That language actually ought to come out of our contracts. I think that's the next step for us. Here's Jeff Hicks, formerly of Crispin. Advertising is not a service business. We're a product business, like publishing and other businesses that deal with intellectual property. And we actually know this business because this is how we work with the people we hire, isn't it? When we hire actors and writers and musicians, this is the model we use to pay them, and this is just turning the mirror around on ourselves and asking, could we maybe use that same model for ourselves? So we have lots of interesting examples of IP, more and more of this every month. This is Rockfish, again, and their coupon factory. This is kind of a white label version of Groupon that allows marketers to create their own coupons. So Rockfish owns this IP, they license it to marketers. So they've got several things they've developed that they license and create these new revenue streams. Smith Brothers, a 4A's member in the Pittsburgh area. They are specialized in CPG, mostly food brands, and as a result of their expertise in this category have developed a couple of products with these acronyms, Data and Dig, that they license to their CPG clients. It's their IP. This is Be Real, very innovative production company / agency, headquartered in Sweden, but they're very well known here, do a lot of work in the US. And one of their many projects, these guys are very innovative IP developers. They call this Escape From. You basically fill in the blanks, say where you'd like to escape from, and they will make some suggestions. This is obviously an online property. I love this fact that KBS, as part of their brief, as part of their creative or strategic brief, they have a line on the brief that asks, what is the marketing invention that will deliver the desired behavior? So in addition to target audience, consumer promise, consumer benefit, reason to believe, whatever else you might expect on a brief, they have a line that also says, what's the marketing invention that might deliver the desired behavior? Because maybe the solution here is not an ad. Maybe the solution here isn't a message. Maybe it's not communication. Maybe it's a marketing invention of some kind. And I love the kind of thinking that that question inspires. So I think that there is at least an attitude that we could adopt. At least we could have the attitude and philosophy and energy of a startup, even if we don't really decide to like completely reinvent our brands or start a new company. We can at least think and act like a startup. This is Rennie Gleason, who runs the Portland Incubator Experiment. Successful startups assume they're in a fight for their lives and must operate accordingly. Agencies are also fighting for their lives, but don't all know it yet. So I guess, he's saying if we really knew what trouble we're really in, we'd probably be a little more motivated to think and act like a startup. There is a school of thought, which I think is right, that the best way to avoid being disrupted is for us to take the initiative and disrupt ourselves. Because we will be disrupted. We are being disrupted. The market forces are very disruptive, and procurement in particular trying their best at breaking our brands apart, whether we want them to be or not. So why don't we just disrupt our own brands? Why don't we do that before it's done to us? And there are a lot of interesting, notable examples of small, mid-size, and large global multinational agencies that have done this very thing. They have, in the past few years, they have actively disrupted their own brand. Here's Venables Bell and Partners up in San Francisco, who made the decision a couple of years ago to launch, to disrupt their brand and launch a new unit they call Orange. As you can see, is described as a brand innovation consultancy. So Orange is designed to do a lot of the things that Venables feels they might not be able to do in the mothership, and that clients might not think of in that way. They think of Venables Bell as a ad agency. So let's disrupt that brand. Let's start another one, and let's let that stand for something else. So this is, in a way, the idea of a lab, but it's this idea of, could we disrupt our brand a little upstream and a little downstream? I'll show you one more quick example. This is Brunner, a forays agency in Pittsburgh, who I think is presented in this meeting before. And so you see in the center is Brunner, the agency. Upstream, they have their lab concept they call Beehive Lab, and downstream, they have a dedicated unit that does production execution. So this is an example of proactively kind of disrupting our own organization into pieces that can stand for something different than the agency has come to stand for over the years. Now, just wrapping up, I'd like to quote from one of my favorite people. Is he here? I love this quote, Tom. I think you'll remember when you said it. Be 20% more selective in chasing new business and invest the cost savings in innovating your own brand. I just love that way of thinking. Because we all know there's 20% of the business that we chase we shouldn't, right? Wasted time and effort. So why don't we just look at that line item on your budget that says new business and has a dollar figure next to it. Let's carve out 20% of that. Let's be more selective in the business we chase, and let's actually physically set that aside in our own R&D budget. Because your clients all have R&D budgets, don't they? I mean, they know to be successful and to be relevant in the future, they have to have an R&D budget. So do we. And this is a great first step, great way to get started, and a really, really healthy way to think about it. But one of my very favorite quotes is from the iconic Peter Drucker, and I had this framed in my office for several years. Starve the problems, feed the opportunities. Starve the problems, feed the opportunities. Now, We have, I think, for too long tried to save our way to success, particularly since the recession. And with procurement breathing down our necks, we've tried pretty hard to wring more and more money out of the revenues we already have, instead of investing our time and energy in finding new and different sources of revenue. That's what Drucker's talking about. And if you think about the nature of problems and opportunities, problems act on us, don't they? Problems walk through your office door, they show up in your email inbox, and they ring through on your mobile phone. But opportunities, we have to act on them. And it's the leaders here in this room that have to make that happen. If you think about the amount of time that you in a day or a week or a month spend trying to solve a problem, working in yesterday, it robs us of all the time and energy that we could be putting into tomorrow. And I think that if we adopt this kind of a philosophy, that actually our future can be pretty bright.